Hey, good afternoon to all. A hearty welcome to our ECHO session, season 15 and session 16. And today we have sessions on palliative care emergencies. The class sessions will take carried by Dr. Pankaj. And our session have first we have 40 minutes of sessions and followed by a discussion. And after that, a presentation by Dr. Srinu. And after that, we'll conduct the discussion also. Then over to Sridev ma'am for the facilitation.
Thank you, Arun. Thank you everyone for joining in on time. I hope some more people will be joining in. By the time we'll start the session. I would like to welcome Pankaj. Nice to see you again through ICO,
Yes.
Pankaj. We were working together for almost a year in Manipal, so happy to introduce Pankaj. Pankaj finished his MD in palliative medicine from Tata Memorial Hospital, and he joined in KMC Manipal in the Department of Pain and Palliative Medicine probably 2 years back as assistant professor. So they have a very well running inpatient unit and an outpatient clinic. So welcome to you, Pankaj.
Thank you, Dr. Sridev. Yeah. So first of all, thank you, Pallium India and TIPS for letting me do this presentation. I think we have met before on one of the session, so you may know me. Today we are going to do a session on emergencies in palliative care. This is one of a very important session because we do not want to miss these emergencies where if we take appropriate steps in identifying them and managing them, then we can prevent a lot of comorbidities and long-term prognosis we can improve in such conditions. And these emergencies, if managed properly, it can decrease a lot of stress in the patients and family members. So what are the common emergencies that we usually see? So I have divided it into the system wise. So if we see into the neurological thing, so a very common problem is malignant spinal cord compression, or in non-oncological things, a lot of traumatic diseases in the spinal cord, traumatic injuries in the spinal cord, and patients comes with paraplegia or bowel bladder disturbances. Other is raised intracranial pressure, that may be because of the disease or any infections and all. Severe delirium or seizures, that is status epilepticus. Others can be metabolic. So the common one are hypercalcemia and hyponatremia. And GI, like malignant bowel obstruction, and respiratory airway obstruction, or superior vena cava obstruction. Vascular, there may be some deep vein thrombosis or acute pulmonary embolism. Patients may come with bleedings, or a lot of patients, especially with pelvic malignancies, they present with obstructive uropathies, that is leading to renal failure also. If we look into the bone, very common, those pathological fractures we see in those patients, or those osteoporotic fractures also can be seen, especially in geriatric populations. And one of the most common emergency that we see is pain crisis. A lot of patients comes in pain crisis, and very rarely opioid overdoses. And that also emergency that need to be managed. And the last is sepsis. So these emergencies we will look in bit detail and discuss about these things. So first is malignant spinal cord compression. So what is malignant spinal cord compression is? If you can see, there is our vertebral column, and in that there is a spinal cord. So any injury into the vertebral column or nearby that may cause compression of our spinal cord. So it can be any extrinsic compression by the bone or some tissues there, or it can be uh, or it can be some disease of the spinal cord itself or metastasis in the spinal cord. Most common one is that epidural spinal cord compression or the extrinsic spinal cord compression that we will discuss. So if we talk about malignant spinal cord compression, so then most commonly it is seen in CA prostate, then CA breast and CA lungs. And most commonly it is seen, that's a debate actually, whether it's lumbar or thoracic. Nowadays it is considered that most commonly it is seen in thoracic vertebrae, because most of those metastasis from CA breast and CA lungs goes into the thoracic vertebrae. So that is usually the label of spinal cord compression. Other common one is a lumbar, and cervical is usually not, they do not present, but it can be very common in traumatic spinal cord injuries. So the next, so how do we identify whether some patient is at risk of spinal cord compression? So I think you may be familiar with this scoring, and that is spinal instability neoplastic score. So what we see, so where is the location of that spine? So there are some common level where the chances of spinal cord compressions are more. So that may be that occiput or C2 region, C7, T2, T11 to L1, and L5 to S1. Whether it's a mobile spine or semi-rigid spine, these are common criteria where how we can score. Other is whether it is mechanical or associated with postural pain, whether it's a lytic lesion or plastic lesion or mixed kind of lesion. On the same kind of scoring we will see in Merrill score when we learn about risk of pathological fracture also. Arun, if anytime my voice is not clear, just let me know, because sometimes I am very low. So just let me know if I am not audible in between.
Okay. Yes, correct, sir.
Okay. So what are the common symptoms? So pain is the most common symptoms. Usually these patients, even before coming into spinal cord compression, they usually reports a back pain that is usually localized, and it can be mild, moderate, or severe, any type. That is usually progressive and increases on movement. And also they can complain that while they are lying down flat on the bed, they feel severe pain. They may not be able to sit. So that pain may vary, but usually it increases on movement or coughing or even sneezing. The pain is usually localized, but it can also be radiating because of those nerve root compressions also. So that radicular pain can be seen. When we examine these patients, they usually have some spinal tenderness also. Many of these patients may also report early neurological weakness or some tingling sensation or some loss of sensation or some disturbance in bowel or bladder function. So maybe urinary retention or chronic constipations. These also can be sometimes features. One of very difficult feature is band-like sensation. They may have a abnormal sensation in a band shape. So that is usually a diagnostic of spinal cord compression in that case. when we examine these patients, so usually these patient presents with UMN lesion. So it may be spastic paraparesis with exaggerated reflexes and extensor plantar. In these patients, usually we can find a level, where is the sensory level. So that may help us to find out what is the level of spinal cord compression. It is very important to identify the sensory level so that we can do the scan of only that area, and accordingly we can treat such patients. And sometimes these patients may have some autonomic signs also, that is usually like postural hypotension or blood pressure changes also. So these may be the autonomic features. I'm sure means in your practice you must see these patients also with like lumbar fracture because of pathological fracture and turning into spinal cord compression. So how do we diagnose? The gold standard is MRI. If at all MRI is not available, then we should do the CT scan or X-ray. But MRI, if it is available, we should go for MRI so that we can see the extent of compression into the spinal cord, and we can decide on the treatment according to that. Other investigations, especially in malignancy, can be bone scan in such cases, so that we can easily identify the levels of metastasis in such cases. Then before starting the management, the pathophysiology is very important in spinal cord compression. So what happens when there is a extensive compression? There is a venous stasis of the blood, and this leads to release of interleukins and prostaglandins that causes again the vasogenic edema. And when there is a stasis, edema, and extensive compression is there, that can lead to neurological deficit because of increased pressure on the spinal cord or exiting neurons. This vasogenic edema can also cause the ischemia of the micro capillaries there, and that again ischemia can again result into the cytotoxic edema, and when there is ischemic tissue damage, that can lead to permanent damage here. And based on this pathophysiology, the treatment is advised. So for and prostaglandins and interleukins and other inflammatory things, we usually give steroids or non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs that can help in that. If there is a compression and edema around there, the radiotherapy is usually helpful. And if it is a single level compression, the surgical decompression can be done, and with that vertebroplasty can be attempted. Okay, and so management, as we discussed, that NSAIDs are the drug of choice, but if the pain is not controlled on NSAIDs, we should add opioids depending on the pain severities. Adjuvants are very important. We have to use dexamethasone in the high dose with medications for neuropathic pain also, because usually these patients have neuropathic pain, and usually these patients develop constipations that may be because of the autonomic dysfunctions, or maybe prolonged inactivity, or because of those hypercalcemia or using opioids. So we should use appropriate stool softener or stimulant in such cases. Very important examination that we have to do in all such patients is per rectal examination to see whether the sphincter tone is lax or it is high, and accordingly we can do the management in such cases. So we'll come back to steroids. So steroids, as we discussed, that it inhibits the prostaglandin E2 and also VEGF. So it reduces the vasogenic edema around the compression. And that is the main mechanism of how the steroids helps in spinal cord compression. We should use it in a very high dose. So as per the guidelines, we should give 16 mg of dexamethasone stat, and after that usually the 8 mg TID we should start with in established spinal cord compression, and we should continue till the radiation is started. And once radiation is started, we can slowly reduce the dose. Usually reduction is 2 to 4 mg per 2 to 4 mg per day every 3 to 5 days. So slow tapering of dexamethasone is recommended once radiation is complete. Okay. And second thing that is most evidence-based is radiotherapy. So radiotherapy helps if it is given within 72 hours of the presentations, and especially beneficial if means as early as we can give. So I think this spinal cord compression and also one SVC obstruction, these are the only emergencies that can benefit with radiotherapies, and that those are the like where emergency radiotherapy should be given, and sometimes also in hemorrhages also. Okay. So RT also decreases the pain and the edema around the compression. Usually dose that is given is 30 in 10 fractions, or sometimes the reduced fractions doses can also be given. The outcome depends on the ambulatory functions of the patients, like if the patient was able to walk before the spinal cord compression, usually the outcomes are better. If the patient was bedbound even before this thing, so the outcomes may not be better. And in many centers, they do not give radiotherapy if the performance status was less than 60%. Then comes the surgery. So surgery is recommended when these agents are not helpful. That is means when there is a progressive neurological deficit. If there is any vertebral column instability is there, like there is a wedge fracture or very lytic lesions. In some of the radio-resistant tumors, especially those renal cell carcinomas or osteosarcomas, or when because of that fracture, if there is severe pain and the radiation and pain medications are not help at that point. And also before surgery, we have to rule out that if there are multiple level of compressions, usually surgery does not help. So if there is a single level of compression, we can opt for surgery in such cases. In patients which responds with chemotherapy, like lymphomas or germ cell tumors, chemotherapies can also be given in such scenarios. So prognosis, as we discussed, that it depends on ambulatory status before the development of spinal cord compression. So that is the single most important predictive factor. Others are like whether it's a single mets or whether it's a radiosensitive tumor. Some malignancies like myeloma, breast cancers, prostate cancers have better survival than the lung cancers or colon cancers. Those who have multiple metastases or brain metastases also, and they have shorter survival. So, so that's what we discussed, that if we have a delay in the presentation or the treatment, it may deteriorate the outcome of the patients. Then a second emergency that we usually see in oncology center is raised intracranial tension or raised ICP. Usually causes are either the primary of the brain, like gliomas, or maybe the brain metastasis. So mostly it is the brain metastasis. Common cancers that metastasize to brain are lung cancers or breast cancers. Usually patients presents with severe vomiting, a headache, and sometimes with altered sensorium, or there may be some seizures or some weakness there. This presentation is usually acute within some days, usually progressive, and may have the fluctuating course. Most of those mets are mainly in the cerebral hemisphere or cerebellum. And as I said, that most common cause is lung or breast malignancy. Sometimes melanoma can also metastasize. So what's the treatment? Again, here, wherever you see there is a edema, we have to start the high dose of steroids. And most commonly used steroid is dexamethasone and palliative care setting. So here we give usually 16 to 24 mg of steroids, so 8 mg thrice a day. And if there is no response in initial 3 to 4 days, we have to stop. We can stop if we are using it only for 3 days. If we have used more than 3 days, then slow tapering is recommended. We should continue steroid till radiation is started. So the WBRT is the standard treatment for malignant raised ICPs. And because steroids can cause increased blood sugar, we have to monitor blood sugars every 8 to 12 hourly. Other important treatment, if there is associated edema or raised ICP, then it is mannitol. So before giving mannitol, we have to monitor the BP, hydration, and also the sodium level in those patients. After 3 days of mannitol, we can give oral glycerol also. That can also help in keeping the ICP in the low. If we talk about the pain, the drug of choice will be the paracetamol, and NSAIDs can be given if there are no other contraindications. Usually opioids are not recommended because it can again increase the ICP, or it can increase the confusional state. But if a patient is on opioids, then that should be continuing for pain management. So sometimes these patients may present with seizures also. So in such cases, IP phenytoin is the drug of choice, or oral levetiracetam can be used. After means diagnosis of raised ICP, usually the prophylactic doses of either levetiracetam or phenytoin is given to prevent the seizures, but the evidence is not very supportive for that practice. And as I said, that WBRT, that is whole brain artery, is the drug of, is the treatment of choice. Usually 10 fractions are given, but sometimes as per the patient's condition or logistic reasons, it can the reduced fractions can also be given. If there is a single metastasis or very localized metastasis, then stereotactic brachyradiotherapy can also be given, or surgery can be attempted in such cases also. Then comes the second, the third emergency that we are talking about in the neurological diseases, that is status epilepticus. So when do we diagnose it as status epilepticus? When there is more than 5 minutes of continuous seizures, or more than 2 seizures within 5 minutes, with incomplete recovery of the consciousness. And the cause may be like there are metastasis or leptomeningeal disease, some metabolic like hypercalcemia, hypomagnesemia, hypocalcemia, hyponatremia, very important cause, or hypoglycemia, one of the most common cause. Infection can be related to the brain or systemic infection. Withdrawal of the substances, hemorrhage inside the brain, or hemorrhage leading to shock. Sometimes paraneoplastic or hypoxic things can also be cause for status epilepticus. So treatment will be in, I'm talking about the palliative care scenarios. So we try to secure airway, breathing and circulation, and give oxygen if a patient is hypoxic. The immediate treatment will be midazolam. Midazolam is easily available, usually in most of the palliative care centers. It can be given as a nasal spray. Usually this we give to the patients with a history of status epilepticus. So whenever they get any epilepsy, they can just spray in their nose. Other is they can use the ampoule and keep it below the tongue. Or if they are in a center, then subcut midazolam can be used. If they are in a center where IV medications can be given, those IV midazolam will be drug of choice. And we load with phenytoin, that is 15 mg per kg over 30 minutes. Then if it is not controlled with this, the next drug of choice will be phenobarbital, that is 20 mg per kg. If at all the status epilepticus is not controlled, then we have to consider for palliative sedation in such cases. Then next will be the electrolyte imbalance that can present as emergencies. So we will discuss two. One is hypercalcemia and hyponatremia. So hypercalcemia we usually see either as a paraneoplastic features, or maybe usually in those with bone metastasis. So commonly it is seen with lung cancer, breast cancers, and head and neck cancers, especially in India, because the incidence of head and neck cancers are very high. It can also be seen in lymphoma and CA prostate and CA esophagus patients also. So how do they present? Usually they have some irritability or lethargy or delirium. Very common finding is vomiting and constipations caused by the hypercalcemia, and many a time we easily miss the hypercalcemia part. So if a patient is coming with severe vomiting and other things, other cause we are not able to identify, then calcium should be checked. Because of hypercalcemia, patient may also present with renal failure or dehydration, and as we know that it decreases the QT interval, so it may lead to arrhythmias also. The treatment is very important because it may change the patient's life expectancy drastically, and also it leads to a good symptom control if we treat it early. So first the treatment is hydration, especially if it is mild, so less than 12 if the corrected calcium. Then we give a good hydration to the patients, and most of the patients recovers with that. Diuretics are required only if a patient has signs of fluid overload, like basal crepitations are there, or edema is there, or there are any signs of heart failure is there. Calcitonin is used only if the patient have moderate to severe hypercalcemia. The advantage is it acts within a few hours only, so it is very quick. And the next treatment is that is standard is zoledronate, but it takes few days to act. So if it is a severe hypercalcemia, we can give bisphosphonate. We have to check the creatinine before giving the bisphosphonates. Then steroids. Steroids were usually recommended before, but nowadays the recommendations are against steroids. but we can use it in some of the lymphomas or those tumors that responds with steroids. So mainly limited to the lymphomas. And we have to check calcium every day, if not more frequent, then at least every day we should check. Usually within 3 to 4 days, the calcium level subsides. Okay. Other very common electrolyte imbalance that we see in palliative care setting is hyponatremia. So hyponatremia, we usually divide whether it's isotonic, hypertonic, or hypotonic. Now, what we commonly see in palliative care setting is the hypotonic hyponatremia. Again, hypotonic hyponatremia can be divided into hypervolumic, hypovolemic, or euvolemic. So whenever we see a patient with hyponatremia, what two things we ask is whether this is acute or chronic. Usually it is chronic hyponatremia. Acute we can identify only if we have done a sodium level within a few days back only. So usually in post-op patients, those acute hyponatremia can be diagnosed. Otherwise it should be considered as chronic hyponatremia. Why it is important? Because we should not overcorrect such conditions, like very fast rapid corrections of hyponatremia should not be done. So as I said, in the hypotonic hyponatremia, where so before that we have to do some investigations. So common investigations are urinary sodium level, urinary osmolality, and serum osmolality, and that defines what's the cause, what kind of hyponatremia it is. So whether it is hypervolumic, that is usually seen in the conditions like heart failure or cirrhosis or nephrotic syndrome. Hypovolumic one is usually those patients with dehydrations or those we have used on diuretics. And third is euvolumic, that is commonly known as SIADH. So SIADH is one of the very common presentations, especially in palliative care patients. So how do we treat such conditions? So we stratify it as like whether it's a mild, moderate, or a severe. Severe it is when it is less than 120, and we have to urgently correct hyponatremia if it is less than 120. So treatment of choice, if it is mild to moderate, usually water restrictions correcting the cause, or giving extra salt can be helpful. If it is less than 120, we have to give 3% NS. Giving normal saline or like 1.6% saline usually does not help. The recommendations are for 3% saline. So we should achieve an increase of sodium by around 4 to 6 milliequivalent over 24 hours. So what should we try to do? That these 4 to 6 milliequivalent, we should try to raise it as early as possible. Previously, the guidelines was to check the deficit and then calculate the rate of correction and then give the 3% NS very slowly. But nowadays, the suggested treatment is to give NS fast, usually in first 2 to 3 hours. Correct the sodium for 4 to 6 milliequivalent in initial 2 to 3 hours. Monitor more frequently, and if stop if there is no benefit, no clinical improvement in the patient's conditions on the improvement of sodium by 4 to 6 milliequivalent. Okay, so these were the two electrolyte imbalance. Then we will quickly go through rest of the emergencies. So one of very common emergency is airway obstruction. This is one of the most difficult emergencies that patients go through, or the family members, they feel it very distressing, because patient is unable to take breathe, and they suffocate, and it can lead to a lot of distress in the family uh, and the care and the patients themselves. So the treatment is usually, if we can do a tracheostomy and a patient is not against the tracheostomy is the treatment of choice. And sometimes oxygen can help. High dose of steroids is recommended. So any obstruction, and if you see, and the steroids are a drug of choice. Opioids and benzodiazepines can be used to reduce the anxiety of the patient, and radiotherapy, if it can be helpful, the radiotherapy to the mass, if it can constrict the mass. If it is chemosensitive, or if response to chemotherapy can be given. Then comes the SVC obstruction. So SVC means superior vena cava, that drains the blood from upper half of the body into the right atrium. If there is any obstruction to superior vena cava, there will be a lot of fluid accumulation in our upper body part. So usually how the patients will present, there will be the puffiness in the face or upper arms. There will be engorged veins in the neck or upper chest. And if you, the signs will be to like there will be congested conjunctiva, or there will be swelling in the uvula and the tongue. So that's how we diagnose SVC obstruction. The investigation of choice will be doing a PTCA of the chest, and that will be the that's I haven't mentioned. So CTPA of the chest would be the investigation of choice. And in CTPA, we will find out whether which level the obstruction is. So if it is above the azygos, usually there will be the collateral veins such as cervical veins that are usually dilated. If it is below the level of azygos, the blood will backflow into the azygos vein, and then it will drain into the inferior vena cava. And usually such patients may not present with the breathlessness and all. If it is at the level of azygos, then usually those superficial thoracic vein will dilate, and patients usually present with a severe dyspnea. So this I already told, that there may be the common symptoms will be breathlessness or edema of the face and upper extremity. Patient may also complain of blurring of vision or headache because of edema in the cerebral cortex. There may be breathlessness because of the tracheal edema. JVP is usually elevated. That's how we diagnose SVC. The treatment again is the high dose of dexamethasone, urgent radiotherapy, and chemotherapy in some cases where radiotherapy cannot be given, or those are the chemosensitive tumor like some lung cancers. Diuretics usually does not help, but a course can be given if a patient is symptomatic, and bronchodilators may be helpful. If it is intramural SVC obstruction because of the thrombosis, we can give heparins, or SVC stenting can also be attempted if a patient's conditions permit. So that was about the superior vena cava obstruction. Next will be the hemorrhage. Hemorrhage, again, it's a very distressing emergencies, and it is very commonly seen in patients with head and neck cancer. So head and neck cancers that are in the neck area with that is in the proximity of our carotid vein or internal jugular vein can present with a very massive bleeding, and such bleeding usually is we may not be able to control. That is one of the very dreadful complication. Other bleeding may be like as a hemoptysis, severe hemoptysis. Many times patients with CA stomach or CA colon may present with severe bleeding in the GI tract, or there may be bleeding per vagina also in gynecological cancers. Other causes may be in the patients with leukemias or lymphoma because of deranged uh, coagulation profile. They may present with bleeding problems, and patients with decreased platelet may also cause bleeding. Some other treatment-related causes are like mucositis post-radiation or post-transplant, thrombocytopenia post-chemotherapy, use of anticoagulations, and prolonged use of NSAIDs can lead to bleeding. Advanced liver disease may lead to deranged coagulation profile. DIC is a very common side effect, common complications in infection or sepsis that should be identified. And there may be occasionally some acquired coagulation defects also that can cause us bleeding. So how do we manage the emergency such emergencies? So again, ABC will be there: airway, breathing and circulation. Give a good transfusion if a patient is anemic and if he is symptomatic. So that RBC can be given. Tranexamic acid, usually 1 mg stat, and every 4 to 8 hourly we can give. Vitamin K and FFP are useful if there is any deranged liver functions or deranged coagulation profile. RDP or STP if there are low platelets. There are some local measures like using the PPIs or sucralfate orally, or sucralfate enema can be given. Hemostatic radiotherapy is again important. If it's a microcapillary bleed, the hemostatic RT can decrease bleeding. Then the most dreadful complications like terminal hemorrhage if there is more than 1.5 liter in a half a minute. In such cases, usually we don't have time to give any active treatment. So in such cases, we should calm the patient and family members, because they get anxious by the sight of blood. So we should give them dark towels, provide a sedation to the patient. And there we can use midazolam. And most important is the assurance for the family members and being there for the management. Then comes the pathological fractures. This is again very commonly seen in palliative care patients, because they are frail, most of them are elderly, and they are on many drugs that can that may make them prone for fall, and they usually do not go outside, and they are bedbound, so they have tendency to develop the fractures or weak osteoporotic bones. And plus, if there is a bone metastasis, that again can decrease and can increase the chances of pathological fractures. So there is a Merrill scoring for that. I'm sure that you must know about the Merrill scoring. So it depends on whether it's on the bones of upper limb or lower limb, or in the peritrochanteric regions, whether it's associated with pain, what's the kind of lesion, is it lytic, mixed or blastic lesions, and the size of metastasis or the fractures. So if it is involving more than 2/3 of the cortex, immediate surgical interventions may be needed. So it depends on overall Merrill score. If it is 9 or more than that, then we have to do the prophylactic fixation. If it is 8, then we use our clinical judgment based on the risk. And if it is less than 7, usually we give the radiation, and or we can keep the patient on observation. Patient may not require the surgical intervention in such cases. Next, and one of the most common emergency is acute pain crisis. So when do we call the acute pain crisis? So if a patient reports severe uncontrollable pain that has NRS of 7 out of 10 or more than that, and it usually requires the rapid opioid infusions to provide the analgesia. So it should be considered as a medical emergency, because if it is not cured, if it is not tackled immediately, patient may have the anxiety or the negative thinking because of pain, and many of such patients do not complete the treatment because of inadequately relieved in the acute pain crisis. So what we usually do, so the drug of choice is either morphine or fentanyl. So if we are using morphine, we should give either it is IV or subcutaneously. IV should be from 1 mg up to 10 mg, depending on the drug required, means how much the patient was already on. After giving the dose, rescue dose, we wait for 5 minutes. If patient still have pain, then we again give the same dose and wait for 5 minutes. If still the pain is not controlled, we have to increase the dose by usually around 50%, and then we give it. So as we know that the morphine can cause the vomiting in such cases, we should give some antiemetic like metoclopramide or haloperidol in such cases. If a patient does not get pain relief, then in such cases some sedatives can also be used in such cases. Other co-analgesics that can be used with in the acute pain crisis situations. So those are like dexamethasone or IV NSAIDs like diclofenac can be given. In patients with very severe neuropathic pain, you can give lignocaine challenge or IV ketamine in such cases. And if it is related with a lot of anxiety, or patient is the pain is not getting controlled, you can also use midazolam for as an anxiolytics or as a sedatives. Then next will be the opioid toxicity. So sometimes if we are not using the supervised opioids, or a patient is on IV opioids, we are doing the very high, we are using a very high dose of opioids. In such cases, patient may present with opioid toxicity. So when should we look for opioid toxicity? If a patient is on very high dose of opioid and present with sedation or confusion, delirium, hallucinations, and a patient has pinpoint pupil, there are some myoclonic jerks there, and the respiratory rate is less than 12. In such cases, we should identify it as opioid toxicity. So the drug of choice for opioid toxicity is naloxone. So naloxone is given, either it can be given subcut or IV. So indication is if there is respiratory rate less than 8 per minute, or if a patient is clinically cyanosed, but he is difficult to arouse, and the respiratory rate is also less than 10 to 12 minutes. or if a patient's saturation is less than 90 and is very difficult to arise, and the respiratory rate is less than 12. In such cases, we usually dilute a 0.4 mg vial of naloxone in 10 ml NS, and we administer every 2 minutes and the 0.5 ml of that solution until the respiratory status is satisfactory. So that was about the opioid toxicity and most common emergencies in palliative care. Some emergencies that is common, I am sure you must be seeing, are spinal cord compressions or fractures or hyponatremia. These three, I'm sure, even in your practice, you must be seeing.
Thank you so much, Pankaj, for your elaborate presentation. And we have heard almost all the complications that we see on a regular basis in palliative care, starting from spinal cord compression, electrolyte abnormalities, pain crisis, breathing issues, almost everything you have covered. We can take a few questions before the presentation. We have 10 minutes. So I understand this group, as they are doing their post-graduation in PMR, they don't see much of cancer-related complications in their regular practice. But yeah, let's ask them. Anything from your side? Do you see these kind of complications? Any of the complications mentioned in today's session?
We get a lot of references for bracing, spinal bracing due to fractures related to malignancy.
Oh yeah, true. And will you be getting patients inventing spinal cord compression or?
Yeah, we get some references for that because we have a regional lymph fitting center under us. So we supply the orthos, spinal orthos.
Any questions from your side regarding the management when it comes to a palliative care situation? Because the management differs in what aspect you are treating.
In hypercalcemia, the management include normal saline, like 3 to 4 liters, like that. But I want to know any specific percentage of normal saline is being used here, like 0.3, like 0.9, like that. Any specific thing?
We usually use the 0.9%, that is normal saline in hypercalcemia. But if there is, like, if a patient is developing hypernatremia with the hydration, we can switch to 0.45, and that is half normal saline also in such cases. But usually the IV fluid of choice will be the normal saline in such cases.
Okay.
I'm sure you must be seeing those fractures, pathological fractures in such patients. How common is it?
Yeah, we saw some, like fracture, but they come in the after being managed by the ortho people. They come only after that. So most of them are stable, I mean, in our department when they come.
But you must be seeing patients with multiple bone mets or vertebral mets being referred to you for, because we do get a lot of people who will be getting a palliative care consultation for pain management as well as consultation to PMR regarding what is to be done for spine stabilization.
Yeah. We got some cases regarding the vertebral metastasis. Yeah.
We prescribe them spinal braces.
Do you think you can contribute a bit more to the pain management now? Like
we avoid physical modalities because there is a chance of the metastasis increasing. So we avoid the deep heating modalities usually.
So do you manage the pain then? Because usually they'll be presenting with pain, most of
Yeah,
them.
mostly we report to pharmacological measures
Okay.
because deep heating is contraindicated in a case of malignancy. So we can't resort to the usual physical modalities, but we have to resort to pharmacological measures and bracing.
So I think one of the very important management of spinal cord compression is also those braces to provide a good support to the vertebrae so that there should not be further damage to those spinal cord injuries. No? So that is also a very, in that case, it is very important to identify whether there is any impending spinal cord compression. And giving a good like brace, using a good tailor's brace is also important, because if they do not use it properly, they may land up with the established spinal cord compression. That's what we have seen many times.
Sometimes they do find it very difficult to wear this.
Yeah.
Like obviously, it's not that as comfortable to wear something like that and walk
Yeah.
around. So, what do you think? Do they come back to you and tell that there is a difficulty in managing these braces? Most of the patients don't wear it; they just keep it because they find it very uncomfortable. But then, uh, as Dr. Pankaj was mentioning, the side effects are really severe. So, what can be done for to improve the compliance when such cases come? They come to you with the same complaints that I cannot wear this. Usually, they don't wear it. That will be kept near the bed, usually in the hospital. Or when they come for consultation, they won't be having any brace at all.
This is something we also know that most people do not utilize or find it difficult to use these braces. But I do not know. We usually do not get these people for review most of the times.
Okay.
They come just before starting some radiotherapy session, and after that, we won't usually see these patients.
Yeah, even if we see this one like that cases, when we ask them, "Oh, where is your brace like that?" They say they forget like that. They like you say, they say they forget. So most probably they don't use it.
Yeah, that's the compliance is a big problem. And usually we have seen with those night kind of tailor's brace that we use usually for thoracic vertebral lesions. Sometimes they say like it is very suffocating or very heavy for them to wear, especially in palliative care populations, because they are very weak and it is difficult for them to use. So we might have to identify such patients, like how the compliance will be for the braces, and accordingly, like from person to person, we can modify something on such cases.
Yeah, true.
Any other questions apart from spinal cord compression? Is there any other part that you want to ask before we move on to case presentation?
DVT, can
Anything
you
on
elaborate?
electrolyte impact? Yes.
Yeah.
Deep thrombosis do you encounter?
So DVT is one of again, it's a very common complications in cancer patients. The usually recommendations are for using low molecular weight heparins. So we usually use either the fondaparinux or enoxaparin because it is quite safe and patients need not to do the blood test every other day. Other, if a patient is not able to afford because these are quite expensive, then warfarin can be used, but that's I think you are aware that the patients need monitoring, very frequent monitoring, especially in the initial part. So sometimes what we do, like we start with enoxaparin, and with that we, after a few days, we start warfarin also, and slowly we stop the enoxaparin and keep the patient on warfarin. And in that way we can we are able to monitor the toxicity of warfarin, and we can, once we find the correct dose of warfarin, we discharge the patient on those steps. Usually we do not use the prophylactic use of those stockings, elastic stockings, because either the compliance again is an issue. Sometimes it is very loose for the patients. So if it is not explained properly, that may not help. And also the evidence what we have found in cancer patients, that those elastic bandages or stockings does not help in uh, prevention of cancer associated thrombosis, or when a patient with advanced cancers, that may not be used. So we do not use prophylactic, usually the prophylactic doses of heparins or enoxaparin or stockings. What is your practice? I wanted to know. Anyone?
We get a few cases only.
Okay.
We don't usually start prophylactic.
Okay. Okay.
Start
So,
a PT program, physiotherapy program, and stockings.
what
We
is? Yeah.
see them in the acute period. Usually, we see them after 3 months.
Okay. So, means as far as I know, in the non-cancers, they use the stockings, and many times if the patient is bedbound, they give a prophylactic heparins or warfarins in such cases. But in the cancer patients, usually that is not recommended. We do not want to add up more complications in such case. What is the practice, Dr. Sridevi, in your center? Regarding use of prophylactic anticoagulants?
We don't start anticoagulants. We don't see much in our patients per se. I don't know why. Maybe they come really late for admission or something. Yeah, it's not that common, I must say.
Maybe if they
Maybe
are
they
doing a
get
good
very, very late
physiotherapist.
referrals. Yeah, we have a physiotherapist full time there. So I don't know whether that is the reason. But even before we had a physiotherapist in the hospice, we see it very less than I have seen there. Maybe because I don't know. I don't know exactly the reason why we see really less. If there are any other questions, we can take up, or we can move to presentation for today. Arjun, yeah. So we can start the presentation. Not Arjun, sorry, Arun.
Arun. Ma'am, I suppose Dr. Sridu is not here.
Okay, yeah, she's supposed to be doing the case.
She's not, means she's not able to log in. I request Dr. Jijo.
Can you do something from your side? Do you know you all see the patient together, right?
Yeah. I know the case.
Okay, so can you present from your side?
Jijo sir, will you be able to present?
Yeah, I can read through.
Oh, okay. So then I will share the slides.
Sure. My patient, 63-year-old male, diagnosis, recurrent severe right hemiplegia, fracture left femur, intertrochanteric, surgically left knee contracture, ulcer left leg, septicemia, anemia, hypothyroidism. Next slide. Presenting complaint, weakness of right upper and lower limb, 1 year, stiffness of left hip and knee for 11 months, and fever 3 days. History of illness. Patient had a previous history of stroke 3 years back involving left upper and lower limb with good recovery and was ambulant in a week. Was on regular medication.
Dr. Sridhu, you are lost. We
Pain
can't hear
left hip
you.
with swelling and deformity. He was taken to MCH Trivandrum the next day. X-ray was taken, told to have fracture, admitted to orthopedics ward. Then his bladder was catheterized, traction put, injection given for pain, regular medication, medicine stopped in view of planned surgery. Surgery was done over left hip, taken to ICU and later shifted to ward. 5th post-op day, he developed sudden weakness of right upper and lower limb. Next slide. Brain imaging done, neurology consultation done, and regular medicines restarted. No associated loss of consciousness, convulsion, facial deviation, difficulty in swallowing and vomiting. After 6 days, discharged to home and had partial limb movement, catheter removed, could sit with support. He had developed sore over left heel during hospital stay, kept knee flexed for same, and later wife found it difficult to extend knee. He was advised traction at home but discontinued it due to itching. Gradually, knee became more stiff and later tried indigenous treatment for same, and which stopped due to bed sore. Due to wife's ill health, they could not review at MCH. Later approached PMR department and was admitted for rehabilitation. Next slide. Here, patient was started on a stroke rehab program. Traction was given to left knee using below knee cast with derotation stroke. Patient complained of pain left foot on the 5th day of casting. Also developed fever. Cast was removed and 2 ulcers were noted over left leg with redness and discharge. Wound care and IV antibiotics were started. Later, he became drowsy with increased breathing rate and skin rashes. Next slide. Functional history. He was independent in all ADLs before the fall and now has a partial bed mobility, supine to sit dependent, sit with support, dependent in self-care, transfers, and wheelchair ambulation. Next slide. Past history. 4 years back had pulmonary TB, took full course. 3 years back, CVA left hemiplegia, recovered, and became ambulant in 1 week. Hypothyroidism since 3 years, and there is a history of varicose surgery. Personal history, bowel habits, continent, no accidents once in 2 days. Bladder habits, continent, normal frequency, sleep and appetite normal. Addictions, he was a smoker and alcoholic since 20 years and stopped following TB episode. Next slide. Family history, his sister is having hypothyroidism. Next slide. Socioeconomic and vocational history. He studied up to 10th standard, was an auto driver, later became hotel supplier and stopped due to varicose surgery, was mostly restricted to activities at or around home, listened to radio for recreation, wife is a homemaker, 2 sons, both have job, lives with younger son. Next slide. Coming to the examination part, vitals are stable and general examination moderately built and nourished. Has pallor and clubbing, no icterus, cyanosis, lymphadenopathy, edema, and elevated JUT. Head to foot examination, maculopapular rash over chest, abdomen, and back, ulcer over left leg. Local examination, 2 ulcers, each of 1 into 2 centimeter over shin of left leg, slough present, and grade 3 ulcer. Next slide. Coming to systemic examination, higher mental function, drowsy, conscious, not oriented, cranial nerves normal, tone, right upper limb and lower limb grade 1 spasticity, right upper limb grade 3 power, right lower limb grade 2, left upper limb grade 5, and left lower limb grade 4 in available range of motion. Sensory was normal. Deep tendon reflexes exaggerated on right side and plantar bilaterally mute. Other system, musculoskeletal system, left knee ROM 80 to 90 degrees of flexion. Respiratory air entry bilaterally equal, no added sound, and a single breath count 26, chest expansion 3 centimeters. CVS was normal. GIT per abdomen soft, no organomegaly, bowel sounds was present. Genitourinary system external genitalia normal. Next slide. Significant investigation. CT showed previous left MCA in fact. HB was 8.3. Peripheral smear showed microcytic hypochromic anemia. WBC was increased in the range of 20,000 and ESR was 67. Ulcer swab showed growth resistant to Acinetobacter species. Next slide. Next slide. Treatment. Medications consist of IV antibiotic, wound care, antiplatelet, statins, iron, vitamin, thyroxine, and supportive. Then medicine consultation was sought, suspicious of septicemic shock and encephalopathy, and was taken over to internal medicine side. Condition was stabilized, fever came down, and then shifted back to PMR side for stroke rehab program. Then achieved standing in standing frame, and then discharged at request. Next slide. Psychosocial aspect. Patient is not motivated, always seems gloomy, not hopeful for an improvement in present condition, not at all willing for surgery to release the contracture. Episode of sepsis had made him further scared for any medical procedure. Patient is a religious person, regularly prays for comfort. Wife has a multiple illness, cries occasionally thinking of her husband's plight. His son want a quick improvement in their father's condition. They are frustrated with their father's condition and scold him quite often. Next slide. Main concerns: left knee contracture. Will he abandon further treatment? Family discord and poor motivation of the patient. Next slide. Summary: 63-year-old male patient who had good recovery from a stroke episode 3 years back and had a fall from bed 1 year back, resulting in fracture left femur. Underwent surgery for the same and developed stroke in postoperative period with weakness of right upper limb and lower limb. Later developed contracture of left knee over a 1 year period, dependent in self-care, transfers, and ambulation. Traction with derotation cast was tried at PMR department, but patient developed ulcer over left leg with fever and rash, was transferred to internal medicine department for sepsis management. Condition stabilized with IV antibiotic, wound management, and supportive care. Then shifted back to PMR department and rehab program continued. Discharged at request for personal reasons. Next slide. Discussion points: treating infection in palliative patient, oral versus IV antibiotic, OP versus IP management. Apathy in patient, how to handle. Unrealistic hope in caretaker, how to approach. Repairing the family bonds. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shritu. Yeah, so can we take one, you finished in one breath, so I think I feel full of a lot of information, but anyway, thank you so much. Can we take the questions one by one, starting from the first question? How do we treat infection in palliative patients, oral versus antibiotics, or IP or OP? Pankaj, I'm not asking them because they all belong to one group and they all come up with the patient they have seen together.
Very elaborative case it is. Means you have covered almost all the things. Yeah, and I think it's a very common scenario in the patients who have. 'Chronic illness, especially like post-stroke. We usually see such things. Okay. So I'm sorry, what were the questions? The screen, no?
Can,
Okay.
you can see the screen.
Yes, I can see it now. On the treating infections in palliative care patients. So I think the infections are to be treated in all the settings. It depends on how severe the infections are and what complications it may cause. So it depends, like whether it's a localized wound infection or it's a systemic infection that need to be treated. And depending on the severity, we can decide whether patient needs oral antibiotics or IV antibiotics. Usually for IV antibiotics, we prefer to admit the patient, but even if a patient cannot or is not ready to take antibiotics in IP, even with the help of local general practitioners, IV antibiotics can be given. So how do you use usually in your practice for treating the severe infections?
Do you admit the patients, or do you just or you tell them to take IV antibiotics if needed from home through a general practitioner nearby, or you admit them and treat? Which way do you manage that?
We will admit here.
What if, means, as you said, that for some reasons they have discharged from the hospital and they are not ready to admit the patient? What will you do?
Could you hear? If they are not willing for admission and you want to give some antibiotic, so in those situations, what will you do? You think that the patient needs an antibiotic and they are not willing for admission. Is that right, Pankaj? That is what you are asking.
Yes, yeah.
We will try to convince them the need of taking the antibiotic, and still they are not willing for admission. We will ask them to take it from local hospital by giving prescription.
We will somehow convince them about the need of the hour. So I don't think usually patient will deny admission in when the situation is grave. And at times, yeah, sometimes we may have to send them back to casualty. We can't send them home. We won't give a prescription like discharge to home. We will only give a prescription to, reference to casualty.
The thing is, like, the patient never ignore admission because they first came for rehab. I mean, for stroke rehab or for other conditions, they come for this kind of conditions. So mostly we don't face rejection from the patient side for admission.
Okay, that is a new information for me. That's good to know. So when you tell them that there is a need of admission, they generally get admitted, right?
Yeah, like generally, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, we don't have to face this scenario a lot. The patients usually approach us for the rehab part. Infections, maybe in the follow-up, we may note some infections. Urinary tract infections, if not symptomatic, we usually prescribe oral antibiotics. We don't see a whole lot of patients coming with severe infection.
So usually we see a lot of patients who are on with a chronic illness or those who are bedbound. Usually if they have indwelling catheters and, as you mentioned, those catheter associated UTI, and the cultures may come out like it's a multi-drug resistant bacteria, and like patient will need only amikacin or piperacillin tazobactam. Like there are no oral antibiotics available in such cases. So in that cases, like we have to use the IV antibiotics, and many a times, especially those patients who have spared a lot of money and they don't want to admit the patient, or the family members are not there to admit to be available with the patient. In such case, maybe taking a help of local general practitioner, talking to them, giving them a good letter explaining about the situations and need of IV antibiotics. In such case, maybe IV antibiotics you can also give at the home care settings also. And with the help of local home care services, you can follow up with them how they are doing. Okay, so yes, in palliative care, we use the antibiotics. Preferred choice will be the oral antibiotics at home, as OP basis or the home care basis. But if needed, we should not go away from the IV antibiotics in home settings or IP settings.
And next question, how do we handle apathy in patients?
I think this is very common thing in patients with chronic diseases. We call it sometimes burnout or apathy, or there are conflicts in the families. Patients get depressed. There may be a lot of reasons. So, what is your how common do you see in your patients this apathy or being sad, not willing for the treatments?
For the treatment in case of acute conditions or general rehab?
I'm sorry?
Whether you are referring to patients who are in acute situations like sepsis or generally?
I'm talking usually about those patients who are chronically ill. They are ill for a very long time, or they have severe symptoms in such cases.
Not we usually do not see so much apathy, but at times, because almost all the patients who come here have already decided to take some treatment or to have some change in their condition. So most of the patients won't have apathy, but if the duration of hospitalization or inpatient care prolongs, we used to see patients losing hope, or patient not willing to follow our orders as in the same spirit they had in the beginning.
Dr. Sridevi, would you like to add in this?
Yeah.
I think you see a lot of patients. We have heard from Dr. Rajgopal about like apathy and how you manage them.
Yeah, so we do get a lot of patients like that who might be fed up with a lot of treatment, in fact, and someone might have told them that this place you go, everything will get fixed. So they just come with a lot of expectations, thinking that one fine day everything will be fixed by us. And then, as you said, when the duration of admission gets prolonged, and then they understand, and then after communication, they will understand that they are in a chronic situation where, especially with in your situation, like stroke patients we do get for rehab. So they think that they will start walking after physio, or they will start walking from us, and it doesn't happen within a few days to weeks. Then we start communicating, then it comes to a state where they give up on everything, and then they don't want to follow whatever things you are telling, because they think that I'm not able to walk, you are just managing my bowel or bladder, which I was prepared for. So that happens, but then we don't drop it there. we keep insisting in a very passionate way, and we keep asking more and more and more about it. And then they have support groups, so they will be having people in wheelchair who might have achieved something in their life, so they come and talk to them that how did they do it. Even though they are in wheelchair, they are doing a lot of things which they can do. They might be doing a lot of stuff, so many kinds of rehab. So when they see the others doing everything, then they find it okay, then I may be also, I may not, I may also be able to do these kind of activities. So that is one thing that works, that's self support groups. They communicate with each other, and still we have a lot of failure, like patients don't feel motivated, or sometimes they feel motivated with us, and once they are back home, they are back to square one. They think, okay, that is it, no one is there to push you in the morning, so that encouragement is gone. So that is something which is very difficult to deal with. But we have a group of social workers who will follow up regularly, who will just call them, or we'll conduct a program where everyone can get together, some training programs, so that they can just come and be there and sit for some time. So that is a reminder that you have to do these things. uh, Otherwise it is just away from us, and when we don't see them again, it is just lost, all your efforts are lost. They'll just be there. And one more thing would be to differentiate between whether it is apathy, or I would say whether the patient is going to depression. We don't know, so we have to see whether the patient is in a pathological depression state, or sometimes in cancer patients it can be a symptom of hypoactive delirium. Suddenly they just stop talking, they become sad with no expression, no interest. So many things to be considered before we think that it can be apathy or something else.
Yeah, so I think that's a way to handle the apathy, as Dr. Sridevi told. And one more thing I would like to add is, if we give a good relief in their symptoms, if they are free from pain, if they don't have pressure ulcer or some other symptoms, that means if the patient is comfortable, usually such like low mood, apathy, or depressions, it can be avoided. Plus, we have to give attention to their social needs, their psychological needs. We have to keep following up with them. As Dr. Sridevi said, the social means support groups meetings, because they see the patients with same complaints, and how they came out of that. That helps really a lot. So support group meetings, yes, that can be a way to handle such cases. Do you do support group meetings in your setting, like PMR settings?
You do have patients sitting together sometime, or but it's not like a sharing stories, right? They just casually meet together, right?
At present, we don't have something like that. We do not formally arrange sessions particularly for that.
Okay, so we have
But,
there is something called All Kerala Wheelchair Association, something.
yeah, but
So they do conduct meetings there. So we give them space to conduct meetings. So it's easy for us. They just come and do their monthly meetings over there. So what happens is that it encourages the other patients who are admitted there. They'll also go there and see what is happening. And then they become a part of the community. They have Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups. And I've seen them, so many people making umbrellas. And one person will be advocating for the other person. If one person is in Trivandrum and the other person would be in other part of Trivandrum, and this person would be advocating for the person, like they advocate for each other through WhatsApp, through Facebook posts and everything. So they and most of them are really young, and they find it really good to have communication with their own groups, because they feel that, see guys, you don't understand our problem. We are in wheelchair and you people are walking and talking, right? When other people exactly like in your situation talking to you in whatever they have managed, and they might have gone through much bigger problems, but they might have managed, it gives them a lot of strength to come out. And again, your third point also comes in under that discussion. Unrealistic hope is very, very common, not only in caregivers, I told in patients also. They think that they will just walk one fine day. They go for Ayurvedic treatment, take some massages, and they think that they're going to walk. And they say that this is ineffective. When I did the massage, it was more beneficial than this. So many things come out, but it is just listening to them and repeating the same communication every day. What is achievable, what is not achievable. Listen to everything that they say, all the complaints, and then again you say, okay, this is what we think is achievable, and this is what we think is not achievable. Not in a very defensive way, but just be in your stand every day, every single hour. You may have to tell this, and make sure that all your team members will say the same. Because some of the team members, they try to escape the situation. They'll say everything will be all right, and they just escape, and the patient will cling on to that particular statement and tell you that, okay, that doctor told me that everything will be all right. So we make sure that all the team members will convey the same single message, that you may not be able to walk, you might be able to sit in a wheelchair but not be able to walk. So that reminders every day usually works, although it is not a happy news to tell every day. If there is no other question for discussion, I think we have reached 4:30. And anything from your side, Dr. Sritu or the PMR team?
No.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and coming up with the presentation this week again. Thank you so much, Pankaj, for your time between your schedule. Thank you so much for coming again and accepting our request for the book. Thank you.
Thank you.
And there is a feedback link in your chat session. Please send in your feedback before you log out. Thank you, everyone.
Ma'am, thank you. I request everyone to attend the feedback within 2 minutes. It's a request.